Wizard 101 is a game that doesn't explain all of its classes very well, and as a new player, I can imagine that that is pretty annoying, pretty infuriating. So I have used all 10 years of my Wizard 101 experience to bring you a Wizard 101 PvE class guide going over what these schools really do, what their job is in the dueling circle, and how good they are at all using these criteria with a 1 to 5 star rating in each. What does this school do? Essentially, I'll be explaining what the school does. Does it do a bunch of damage? Does it do a bunch of healing? Does it tank? Do they buff other players? Can they fit in one role? Can they fit in multiple? What are some glaring flaws, glaring strengths, etc.? Solo ability. Now, while Wizard 101's player base is steadily growing and has been since 2020, it's still kind of tricky to find people to help you out with mid-game boss fights, dungeons, etc. So how well are you going to be able to solo as a new player on this school? Now, solo ability is judged on a couple of factors here. Access to AoE spells, which are spells that can attack all the enemies on the board, really helps you get through content quicker and easier. Survivability. Do you have access to healing? Do you have access to specific shields? And then lastly, good HP and resistance. You want that good HP, good resistance, helps you live, and living is important because if you die when you're soloing, the match is over, you just lose, you have to restart. Team play and utility. Is this an optimal school to run in a group? How much utility can this school provide to a team? Every school fits into a role, either support, DPS, sub-DPS, or tank, so how good are they at their roles? And can they do more than what their role asks for and go above and beyond those expectations? How fun is this school to play? Now this category is pretty straightforward. Just how fun, how engaging is the school while you're playing it? Now, obviously, this is a pretty opinionated topic. I mean, everybody thinks the different roles are more fun than others. Some people like to hit, some people like to tank, some people like to heal or support and stuff like that. What the criteria is for me is the gameplay loop fun or satisfying? Are the spells cool? Is the aesthetic cool? Does the class make you feel powerful? Etc., stuff like that. First up on the list, we have ICE, and ICE is a school that I have been giving too much credit. Maybe every year I've played Wizard 101 for PvE at least. Let me explain. So ICE is the pure definition of a tank school, right? You have the HP, you got the res, you go in, you take the hits like a champ, and honestly, this means your game plan as an ICE wizard is very simple. You go in first, you tank the hits, you buff your hitter if you've got the time to do so, make sure the aggro is on you, and that's most of what you do, at least in a team setting. That's 4 out of 5 stars for accessibility in my opinion. Again, not much to digest or explain here, pretty simple school. Now in terms of solo ability, ICE still remains as an extremely solid soloing school in my opinion. I mean, a lot of us wizard vets grew up back in the day watching Alexander Lionheart doing crazy boss runs on ICE back in like 2014, and it's still a good tank school to this day, I'm not gonna lie. You've got that natural health, you've got that natural res, and one thing you will notice about tanking schools and the solo ability category as a whole is that tankier schools are gonna skew towards being better at soloing than weaker and more fragile schools, because not every school has that survivability, that innate survivability, is able to survive multiple rounds. Every school can train feint and kill bosses and enemies in a reasonable amount of time, at least for most of the game in PvE, but not every school can live and can take a ton of punishment. So those schools that naturally can do that and are better at that are going to skew higher in the solo ability ranking, in my opinion. Now, I understand some vets can solo with Storm, solo with Fire, and can brag about it and puff their chests out in the comments. That's cool. But for a newer player, you're not going to want to solo on more frail schools. And schools like ICE are a great choice for beginners, especially for soloing. You are going to run into one issue soloing on ICE, though, and that is the lack of sustainability. Now, I know this might sound a little bit contradictory. Listen, I was talking about earlier, all the tanky stats, that's going to help you out a lot, and they will, but you can't heal very well as ICE. That's the big problem. ICE doesn't have a natural heal in their kit, and sure, you can get a life mastery and train it up, but you're gonna be paying those boozoo bucks to King's Isle. It's $10 out of that paycheck you worked so hard to earn feverishly, and the goal of this is to give you a guide on what classes are the best for spending as little money as possible. I'm not gonna be taking into account life mastery. I'm not gonna be taking into account a lot of pay-to-win things. ICE does struggle with that. The best option you're gonna have is spending 4 pips on Satyr for the majority of the game, and that is a bit of a problem. A, because it's going to spread your training points thin. You already need to spec into feint since you're not playing death, right? Every school that's not playing death is gonna have to spec into feint, which is a great spell that allows you to put a 80% trap on any boss, meaning your spells are just gonna nuke and it's gonna be great. No other spell makes hits better than that. and you're going to need to spend a bunch of training points on it in the early game and potentially the mid game. So having to spend time on spending training points on Feint as well as spending training points on Satyr it's tough. It really spreads you thin. It kind of restricts your access to what astral spells you can get, especially in the mid game. Going into second arc, it's kind of annoying and a pain to balance everything out. And other schools, especially other tankier schools, don't really struggle with this issue. A la Death, a la Life, they don't have this problem as badly as Ice has it. Not to mention, the bigger problem in this is that when you are healing in any boss fight, you have to choose between whether you're gonna hit or whether you're going to heal yourself. Now, this isn't an issue for some schools, but for Ice, again, it is a pretty big issue because, again, you don't have a heal you can pump power pips into, which means it's going to take 4 pips, power pip or not, to use your spells. And again, power pips, for those that don't know, basically count as 2 pips for casting spells in the school that you are. So say you're a life character and you're gonna cast Satyr. Satyr is 4 pips. It's just 2 power pips, right? Which is essentially 2 turns worth of time going into that spell. Now, Ice is gonna have to spend 4 turns of time going into that spell no matter what, which is awful because you could actually be hitting with that amount of pips. That can be upwards of 8 pips towards Ice spells that are going towards a heal that might not even full heal you, depending on your build, and that kind of sucks. I'm gonna say. It may not sound like the biggest deal ever. Again, it's mostly an inconvenience rather than a gameplay hindrance, but those amounts of dead turns you're gonna have just waiting, sitting on your hands, waiting to get pips to hit after you heal is just annoying, and it adds up over time. I think Ice is still a 3.5 out of 5 stars in terms of solo ability, just because it's not super hard to solo as Ice. It's just not super convenient. It's not the most streamlined way to do it, and it's not, in my opinion, most fun way to solo the game. Now, when it comes to team play and utility, at first glance, Ice seems like it would be a great school for any team, right? I mean, after all, every team needs a damage sponge to go in first, and Ice is the most health and resistance in the game, so it seems like a perfect school for the tank role. As we mentioned earlier, right? Quintessential tank, take hit good, right? No. Not really. I mean, Ice does have that incredible bulk, and it is still a good tank school for sure. It really doesn't provide much else in terms of utility, aside from like treasure card blades or tower shields. See, the other schools that Ice competes with for the tank role in a squad have enough beef to survive just fine. They don't have the most health or the most res in the game, but they have plenty, enough to sustain themselves, and they also, along with that, provide extra utility for the rest of their squad naturally, innately. It's just built in their kit. They can buff your hitters like balance, heal your entire team, huge like life, weaken and debuff enemies like death, and so on and so on. Ice doesn't have any of that naturally built into their kit at all. And sure, you can, again, get life mastery and train strong healing spells like Pigsy, Satyr, etc., but your healing output just isn't going to be the same as, say, a life wizard, for example, whether you decide to buy a life mastery or not. Sure, Ice is bulky, and that is something that they can provide to a team. They also have innate access to training Taunt, which is a good tank spell as well, keeps the aggro on, and you gotta love that for tanks. Sure, Ice is a bulky school. I'm not gonna say that isn't, but they don't really have the utility that the other schools they're competing with for the tank role have, and they don't do anything that they can't. So it's 2.5 stars in utility for me personally. I think 2.5 baseline average. They do their job. They don't go above and beyond. That's a good spot to put Ice. Now, how fun is Ice to play? Well, I'm a little bit biased. Ice was the first school I really ever picked and beat the game with, aside from like when you see the ads on TV on Cartoon Network and you build a character for 10 levels and then you quit because Firecat Alley exists and you get Dono Wall. You know, I still don't think they're all that great. They're not the most fun, I'll be honest. The thing about Ice for a lot of the game, and this goes for some of the other tank schools as well, but I think Ice especially so, when you're playing in a group with a group of friends, you kind of are just sitting around doing nothing for a large chunk of the game. And it's kind of boring, it's kind of annoying. Again, you're sitting on your hands for a lot of turns. It's not the most engaging. But once you get to tough boss fights in the end game, like in the Catacombs, for example, where it actually is genuinely engaging and fun to play a tank and figure out how to balance your resources and what spells to cast when to buff, when to weakness, when to heal, when to do this, that, and the other thing, it just gets a lot more fun. Playing tank suddenly becomes probably the most fun and engaging role in the game. Not to mention, there's something pretty cool about having 10,000 health all the time and feeling like that immovable wall that Ice is supposed to feel like. Makes you feel like a big, gruff, brawly MMO character, well, as close as you can feel in WIZARD101. I'd give Ice 3 out of 5 stars in terms of fun. This leaves Ice with a final rating of 3.25 stars out of 5. An extremely beginner-friendly school with a ton of bulk to it. If you're planning on soloing the game, Ice is one of the schools I very much recommend for you. If you're a new player especially, you can understand what you do pretty easily. You tank, hit good, that's great. And I think it still remains a solid school throughout the entire game. Maybe not the most optimal, but still very solid. Now, next up, we have Fire, which is a very, very good hitting school. Very different from Ice, which is all in tanking, not really much in the DPS aspect. Fire is all damage, mostly. The school's main gimmick is damage over time spells, or dots, which is what I'll be referring to them as for the rest of the video, which means their attacks are split up between one big initial hit of damage and then a damage tick that occurs after that procs with a little bit of damage for a few turns after that first initial blow. And listen, these hits aren't always optimal since they don't make good use of traps such as Feint, which act as a huge buff for one big hit. I don't think this holds Fire back all that much though, since their bread and butter is Fire Dragon, which is a nuclear warhead on that first hit regardless. They also have access to some strong single target spells such as Fire from Above, Ifrit, and Sun Serpent that can do absolutely massive single hit damage to any boss out there, blowing them up like a 1600s Pilgrim, eating a warhead for the first time, just complete splatter everywhere. Great spells, very high damage. Now in terms of accessibility, Fire is, I would say, decently accessible. They have a lot of strong hits first off, and they aren't completely bad defensively. I mean, they're bad defensively. Statistically the second worst school defensively, but it's not horrible to play for a new player, kind of. It's not that bad. You'll be able to deal with it, I think. Using Fire optimally, all those good hits, dots, can be kind of tricky to use right for new players, as we've stated before, and Fire's lack of bulk makes it tough to deal with a lot of bosses throughout the game, especially if you're soloing. That being said though, even if you're not using Fire optimally for a while, it is still pretty good because Fire Dragon will go burr whether you like it or not, whether you're trying hard or not. And because of that big boon being Fire Dragon and being just like a big stick you can throw at everything, I would say Fire averages out to a 2.5 out of 5 stars in accessibility. Listen, you aren't going to tank hits well, and some of your spells are a little awkward to use right, especially once you get Rain of Fire. It's culture shock, whoa, something that doesn't nuke everything with the first hit, crazy. But you do have a lot of great spells that are easy to use, and especially if you're playing with a group, you'll be killing things no problem, not a big deal at all. 2.5 out of 5 for accessibility. Now, when it comes to solo ability, we did talk about earlier how the tankier schools are going to be better for soloing, while the more frail, weak, fragile defensive schools are going to skew worse. And Fire, being one of those fragile defense schools, are not great for soloing, especially for new players. And I mean, sure, you can do a lot of damage, but you got to keep in mind your bulk is the second worst in the game here with this school. This doesn't allow for a ton of leeway for mistakes in boss fights, and sometimes if your setups fail to kill, or you end up proccing an unfortunate fizzle, you'll just end up getting taken down by just random bosses throughout the spiral that aren't even like good or notable or anything. Fire also doesn't have that much in the way of tools to help that survivability out either. I mean, sure, you get some stuns and accuracy debuffs, but very few Fires out there are ever really going to be using these at all in boss fights, unless it's against maybe some really tough boss you need something to do for a turn and you don't know what else you're going to do. I don't know, it's not something you're really going to build for. Not to mention, both of these pieces of utility are extremely unreliable, with accuracy debuffs only decreasing the chance of an enemy hitting without outright negating it, and most bosses being completely stun immune anyway, completely immune. Like, if you use the stun card, it will do nothing to them. And sure, these are good spells in PvP, or at least were back in my day, but in PvE, they are almost entirely worthless and completely underwhelming. For a new player, I would stay away from it. Bulk is your best friend, as someone who is new to the game. I would average out Fire at 2.5 out of 5 stars in solo ability, because if you're a more veteran player, it's better, but that low HP, that lack of utility, that low res, I can't give it more than 2.5 out of 5. I want to. I like Fire a lot. It, again, was a school I've played a lot of, but 2.5 out of 5, you can't really go above it in this category in particular. Now, when it comes to team play and utility, Fire is honestly a pretty fantastic choice, which may sound hypocritical, but you gotta hear me out for this, right? When it comes to team play and utility though, Fire is honestly a fantastic choice for any team looking for a hitter. Now, most teams are gonna have 2 hitting slots, in my opinion. That's how I would best build a team. One being a primary hitter and one being a backup hitter to sort of just sweep and clean up in case the primary hitter can't do the job. Now, Fire is utterly fantastic in either of these roles, in my opinion, and has a strong, diverse spell kit to hit against any kind of bosses. Again, there are some bosses in the game that you need AoEs to kill optimally, and Storm, which is the other big name hitting school, doesn't have that. Fire does. And that helps boost fire in that team play and utility regard, because it may not do as much outright damage as Storm does, but it has enough damage to nuke every boss and has other spells that can come in handy against bosses with weird cheats that you can't just outright nuke with one-hit wonders. Now, this diverse arsenal allows fire to be a reliable hitting choice in any situation, which I think is invaluable to any team out there. They do fill the hitting role extremely well, and I think that's enough to give them 4 out of 5 stars in team play and utility. They're great on a team because they are a great hitter, and every team wants a good hitter. 4 out of 5 stars straight up. Now, how fun of a school is Fire to play? It's pretty fun in my opinion, man. It's really, really fun. The spells are wickedly cool. The attacks are powerful and you do big damage, hit big numbies. Feel good, man. Hitting big numby feel good. Woohoo. And you just feel like absolute force of nature. Smokey Bear's worst enemy, lighting people up like it's no tomorrow. And this isn't even mentioning how fun and diverse your arsenal of viable AoE spells is. So it's not just eat, sleep, fire, dragon, repeat, as easy as it is to do so, and as much as that is viable, there is some actual thought and diversity in the gameplay loop from fight to fight, from boss to boss, and I personally really like that variety. Sure, sometimes you'll fizzle and sometimes you'll die to your setups failing, and that isn't particularly fun. It's pretty frustrating, especially early game, but this doesn't happen to Fire as often as it happens to a certain other hitting school that we will be talking about later, but this doesn't happen really that often early game generally. 4.5 out of 5 stars in the fun department. Really, really fun school. You'll have a great time. Though, again, it may not be the best solo school for a beginner, but I'm sure you'll make it work. You're smart like that. You got it. Don't worry about it. You'll do great. This leaves Fire with a final rating of 3.375 out of 5 stars. All in all, not the most beginner-friendly or solo-friendly school out there, which is what drags the rating down just a bit, but oh man, this school is something else in the squad. And if you're willing to put in the work or figure out how to use your arsenal of spells properly, you'll be an extremely solid and flexible hitter that any squad will be super happy to have. I mean, there is a reason that this is probably the 2nd or 3rd most popular school out there. In the spiral, in the wild, you'll find Fires all over the place, left and right, in every nook and cranny, because it's just a dang good, dang fun school to play. You won't regret picking it unless you're soloing, then you might regret it a little bit. Now, next up, we got Big Daddy, Big Numby, Wolf, Stormblade, Storm School. Now, what does Storm do? Well, Storm takes Fire's biggest strength, its damage output, and its biggest weakness, its bulk, and amps them both up a couple of notches. This school hits, by far, in my opinion, the highest numbers in the entire game, dishing out noticeably more damage than every other class, even at level 1 with Storm Snake. They also die noticeably more than every other school, even at level 1 in Unicorn Way to the Lost Souls. Listen, all they do is kill guys or get killed by guys. There is no in between. There's no equilibrium. It is a school of extremes. It is the gambling man's school. Now, in terms of accessibility, I'm just gonna get this out of the way now. If this is your first time playing Wizard 101, or at least your first time playing in a while, and you're soloing, God, don't pick Storm unless you know you'll have a group to play with. Just don't do it. Soloing with Storm when you don't have great gear already is an extremely, extremely difficult task. Sure, you can do some insane damage, and that's fun, and it's funny, and it's cool and neat, but sometimes you'll get bad RNG and die before you can even get a single hit in due to Storm having that low natural accuracy, the lowest in the game even, and that's not even talking about the low HP, lowest HP and lowest res in the entire game as well. These weaknesses get less crippling the further and further you get in the game, I will say that, but they absolutely make that early game just awful sometimes. One thing I will say is that if you are playing in a group, Storm is super easy to understand, and that incredible fragility is almost entirely offset if you have someone else taking all those hits for you, like an Ice maybe that we were talking about earlier. 3 out of 5 stars for accessibility. It is easy to understand, but man, it can be not fun, and you're gonna lose a lot, especially if you're new in solo. Solo ability wise, I think you can imagine what I'm gonna say here. I would so unbelievably highly recommend not picking Storm for soloing at all, unless you have access to some really good crowns gear throughout the levels, or you just have gear armed up from playing through the game on a different school first. You're gonna fizzle a bunch, you're gonna die a bunch, and sometimes you won't even die by something you did. It won't even be your fault. God just chose to hate you that day in that moment, and you're just gonna have to accept that and go to bed crying at night. One good thing, though, is that you get the AoE Tempest at level 28, and that is an utterly amazing spell you'll be using for the entire game. Ooh, it's so good. You get so much use out of it. You will use it for the entire game. It's great. If you're an extremely experienced player with solid crowns gear already, or you farm for gear already, or you're willing to throw some money onto packs, by all means pick Storm. You'll blitz through the game faster than Usain Bolt and have a fantastic boss farming wizard built up at the end of your run. 1.5 out of 5 stars solo ability though, but this rating does go up if you invest some big boozoo bucks into your account. Storm, I will say, is great for a team in the same way that the aforementioned Fire School is great for a team. This is a fantastic option for a hitting school. You'll have pretty much no trouble fitting into a squad ever, even though hitting is the most popular role in Wizard besides Death. If you're playing Death, Death is the most popular role in Wizard 101. It's not tank, it's not support, it's not hitting, it's just Death. But we're not talking about Death right now, we're talking about Storm. And you're not going to be doing much as Storm aside from blading yourself and hitting, but you do blade and you do hit better than anyone else for 90% of the time. The only gripes I have with Storm as a hitting school is that they don't have a single free trainable dot spell. There are cases where you're going to wish you had one up your sleeve, whether it's for a few specific boss farms or some random enemy shield spamming you, making your life suck. Storm has the same level of team play and utility rating as Fire. It's a 4 out of 5 stars for sure. Now, how fun is Storm to play? I mean, Storm is the most popular class in the game for a reason. And when you're playing in a group, Storm is possibly the most fun school to play in the entire game, in my opinion. You do that absolute metric tons of damage. You never know if you're gonna hit or not hit, and sometimes that's fun. Sometimes you like to gamble. Look, it's like gacha games. You're like playing a gacha game every fight. How fun is that, right? Genshin Impact, am I right? Am I cool with the kids yet? Yeah. Basically, if you're playing with a group, you get to gamble as much as you want, and those weak taking stats don't really matter too much. When it comes to soloing though, you're gonna hate your life sometimes. It gets annoying when you have so little bulk and so little accuracy, especially early on in the game. I'm gonna give Storm a 4 out of 5 here, but the amount of fun you're gonna have does fluctuate a ton depending on how many people you're playing with. This leaves Storm with a final rating of 3.25 out of 5 stars. Definitely a class with extreme ratings. Storm is a class with insane positives and insane negatives. If you like the highs and lows of gambling or Genshin Impact, this is the class for you because it always keeps you on your toes. If you want to have a blast hitting in a team or just want to risk your sanity soloing, Storm is a solid choice for you. All right, next on the list, we got Death. And I mentioned him briefly earlier, and we're moving from the second most popular school, arguably, to the most popular school. It's Death, baby. Now, let me tell you, this school is popular for a goddamn reason, because Death slots the best into the tank role of any 4-stack, in my opinion, bar none, period. It can be a solid choice for hitting, and even support if you want to roll like that as well. And this might seem a little weird at first glance, because in terms of raw HP, Death is actually ranked 4th. So how can you be the best tank school in the game if you are literally the middle of the pack, the center point, the average in health and resistance? Well, it comes down to 3 major factors. One, and probably the least important, is the innate access to Feint without having to drop any training points on it. Now, we've been over what Feint does and why it's the single best PvE spell in the game, but other schools can train it eventually too and buy it pretty reliably from the bazaar if you still haven't trained it yet. So what makes this a relevant upside? Well, not having to spend training points on Feint gives you the freedom to spend these training points on so many different things at a very critical point in the game. You have more leeway to train those astral spells you get bombarded with at the beginning of Arc 2. You have more room to easily go for Satyr or even Tower Shield or Weakness if you want to get a little bit crazy, a little bit wild with it. You just have a significantly more flexible training pool than pretty much every other school in the game, which shouldn't be understated. Second, you have Death's biggest gimmick, which is that they can heal themselves with their attacks. Now, this isn't particularly relevant if you're running a 4-stack with a hitter and a backup hitter, but in smaller squads like in duos or trios, it allows you to play multiple roles at once. Not only does Death have that lifesteal ability to make them entirely self-sustainable in a small group, but they also do have some surprisingly good damage in their spells. They pack a punch. So if you're running a smaller group of 2 or 3, you can run Death as a pseudo main tank slash hitter slash support hybrid, which is a bit absurd that his school can have that many tools, but they really can make it work. Now, the third and final reason I hold Death in such high regard as a tank school is that their access to useful enemy debuffs like Plague and Virulent Plague are great, especially for late game end game bosses. These 2 spells are Death School exclusives and can't be learned by other classes with training points, and in tough later game dungeons again like Darkmoor, a well-timed Virulent Plague right before a high damage cheat cast AoE can be the difference between life and death in a run. Now, in terms of how easy it is to pick up Death and play it, it's easily one of the easiest of the bunch. Listen, you don't die ever, you heal every time you attack, and that's about it really. You don't have to worry about when to attack and when to heal, you just do it all at once, and you're realistically never ever in any danger of dying ever unless you're playing horribly wrong. Once you get to the end game though, and your team is relying on you to put all of your amazing utility to good use, it can be a little overwhelming and anxiety inducing because you do have a lot of different options on what spells to use every turn, just like all the other tanks. So there is a surprising amount of thinking involved. For these reasons, I'm going to give Death a 3.5 out of 5 stars in accessibility. Listen, it's an easy school to pick up and play at that surface value, but the skill ceiling is extremely high and not the easiest to fully master. Following the trend of good tank schools being good solo schools, Death is an almost perfect school for soloing, in my opinion, the closest to perfect in the entire game. For sure. You got that decent enough health and resistance, and you got that free access to feint. The lifesteal, especially here, is unbelievable when you're soloing because you don't have to spend turns saving up for heals or buying life mastery amulets for heals. You don't have to worry about any of that at all because you just heal when you attack. It saves you time, it saves you stress, it saves you money, and this alone should be enough to prove that Death was lovingly designed to be the perfect solo school in Wizard 101, period. At least it would be if it weren't for one small issue. Death doesn't get a trainable AoE until level 48. So you're gonna be going your entire early game attacking just one enemy at a time, which means you're gonna need to set up and hit twice when all the aforementioned schools only need to do so once. So basically, your early game is going to be twice as slow as, say, a storm player or a fire player or even an ice player. And, well, yeah, there's only a short amount of time where this is the case. First arc is very short. It still bogs down the early game and bumps Death down to a 4.5 out of 5 stars for solo ability, in my opinion. Now, I did touch on the team play and the utility when I was going over what makes Death so great for its role, but direct access to unlimited feints and plagues gives Death an almost unparalleled level of utility for the tank role. Not only do you have enough health and enough res to soak up damage like you've got the suds, but you also have so much utility for every single turn you're playing. You've got traps, you have enemy debuffs, you have a unique blade that only you have access to. You can nerf enemy heals, you can have the spell called Bad Juju that puts a minus 90% damage debuff on an enemy, and when this is timed right, it's absolutely insane. It can save a squad completely from death, and that's not even everything. You could give people pips. You have a surprisingly decent heal that is just a rung below Satyr in terms of healing. I mean, this school is just crazy. This utility is crazy. You can do so much in so many boss fights. It's unreal. 5 out of 5 stars, easily unbelievable in terms of what it can do. And it actively made me go back and make other schools' utility ratings lower because they shouldn't even be comparable to Death at all. That's how good Death is when it comes to team play and it comes to utility. Unreal school. Just, ugh, it's disgusting what Death can do. It's gross. Now, how fun is Death to play? I think Death is a little bit boring early game, in my opinion. You have all this cool utility, but you don't really need to put it to use a ton at all. Again, you also don't have early access to the AoE, so your battles in the entire first arc are going to be slow, they're going to be tedious, they're going to be boring, especially Mushu and Dragonspire. God, you're going to wish they were over so bad compared to other schools that are going to be breezing through with their nice juicy 4-pip AoEs. Seriously, the only saving grace Death has early game is that the spells feel pretty damn cool to cast because of the necromancer aesthetic. However, once you get to late game boss fights and tanking, Death has a complete heel turn from being one of the most boring classes to one of the most fun and engaging straight up. In tough boss fights, every turn you have to weigh out tons and tons of factors to decide which spell is the best one to use in any specific situation. Every turn, even. There's just a lot of factors to weigh out. How many pips does the boss have? How much damage do they have buffs? Do they have nerfs? Does my hitter need another blade? Is the boss about to hit and with throwing out a Beguile here ruin the setup? Is my team doing okay on health? Am I doing okay on health? The list goes on. A lot to think about, a lot to weigh in just 30-second turns. So much critical thought can go into those turns, and that for me is extremely fun and extremely engaging. So Death evens itself out at a 4 out of 5 stars in funness, that's the word we're looking for, baby, if that's even a word. This leaves Death with a cumulative ranking of 4.25 out of 5 stars. An absolutely stacked school in terms of PvE. Death is so good that it actively pushes other tanking schools down in the rankings. An absolutely phenomenal school and a statistical outlier for good reason. It's still only the 6th highest win rate in PvP though, so suck on that, Death School nerds. If you want to be original, pick something else, but if you want to just be good, Death is going to do that for you. Next up, we got the good old Myth School. Now, Myth is probably the hardest school to describe in the entire game, mostly because they don't really do anything that well. Now, this isn't to say that Myth is a bad school by any stretch. I mean, I'm currently soloing the game on Myth right now, and it is an absolute blast. But as much as it aesthetically stands out as a school, gameplay-wise, it falls a little bit flat. So let's talk about how viable this school really is in its intended niche, soloing. Myth is, well, it's okay. It's soloing. You do decent damage. You have below average health, admittedly. utility, and you've got average resistance, I guess. This leads Myth to find itself as sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, that kind of situation. And as we've gone over with the prior schools, this isn't actually that good for soloing at all. Good solo schools, at least for the average new player, are always the tankiest, like Ice and Death. They have a ton of res, ton of health, easy access to utility, healing themselves, etc. So due to Myth's mediocre tanking stats, it's already a leg down on a lot of the competition. At this point, I'm sure you're wondering why KingsIsle even thought this school would be any good at soloing, and the answer to that is because of their quote-unquote gimmick. And I put the word gimmick, again, in massive air quotes, because it gets completely dropped by the time second arc comes around, and that is minions. Myth gets by far the most powerful arsenal of minion spells in the entire first arc of the game, and while summoning a henchman of your own to help you in battle sounds cool and fun on paper, you've got no way of ordering them around, which often leads to them either being completely worthless on the battlefield or downright detrimental by destroying your setups and using your feints and being gross. I could make an entirely separate video ranting about how this system is chock full of missed potential, but to keep it brief, 99.999% of the time, minions will be completely and utterly irrelevant in PvE, and KingsIsle probably knew this too, so they just stopped giving Myth these spells later in the game at all. This results in Myth being a school with no discernible gimmick, and is probably the biggest reason it's in the spot that it is today. With all that being said, I'm gonna give Myth a 2.5 out of 5 stars for solo ability. It can certainly work, and if you have the money and the luck to get access to spells like Grendel Amends from the Grizzleheim lore pack, this school has everything it needs to be able to solo decently well. But for the average new player who doesn't want to spend extra money on this game, Myth is pretty mid when it comes to soloing. 2.5 out of 5 stars. Now, I've already gone over that Myth is a really weird school. It's hard to describe. It has a lot of weird, nichely useful, and sometimes worthless utility, and some clunky, awkward spells that aren't super good. Now, granted, Myth does have some very solid spells, sure, but it doesn't really have any easily discernible gimmick, again, as we've already stated. Let's go over some positive things for a change. Yeah, Myth does some things good sometimes. They get an AoE at level 22, which is great, and also has one of my personal favorite spell designs in the entire game. I mean, peep the Humongo Frog in my outro of every single video I do. Myth also does deal the 3rd highest damage innately of any school in the game, and big number good is a pretty easy concept to wrap the head around. One last thing to mention here is that Myth is not all that tanky of a school, possessing around the same amount of health as Fire for most of the game, if not even all the game, honestly. I'm gonna give Myth a 2 out of 5 stars for accessibility. You do some decent damage and have some good spells, but when you're barely even the 3rd hardest hitting class in the game and have a lot of spells that don't really do all that much, you end up with a very awkward and clunky school for a new player to grasp. Now, when it comes to what Myth can do for a team, this jack of all tradiness comes back to bite it yet again. Listen, I'm seeing a common theme here. I'm sure you are too. The only real spot you can run Myth is as a hitting school, and it does do a decent job at this, don't get me wrong. But thinking optimally, Fire and Storm are just more geared towards being a hitter than Myth is. That being said, however, there isn't that big of a difference between Fire and Myth in spell damage innately, and it can still hang with the big boys of hitting for the most part. When it comes to the utility aspect, Myth does have some decent spells that are good, but can be a little bit niche, such as Shift, Shatter, and Pierce. Shatter is probably the most useful of the bunch, being able to remove all the shields from an enemy without triggering any traps or feints on them and getting rid of those. Myth also has access to a lot of spells that stun, having 4 of them in total. Stun, Blinding Light, Medusa, and Basilisk being the 4. While these are useful in PvP, most PvE bosses are immune to stuns. They are just immune. They do not work on these bosses. So this effect might as well just not exist at all, and it ends up nerfing the card damage of these spells for no reason at all. Aside from these though, Myth does have some decent utility and dishes out some solid damage and can be pretty useful on any team in the right hands. This earns Myth a 3.5 out of 5 stars when it comes to team play. It has some solid utility and a lot of hard-hitting spells, making it a pretty solid choice for a 4-stack, in my opinion, despite the negatives. Now, how fun is Myth to play? Despite Myth's general clunkiness, it's genuinely the most fun I've had playing as any school in a hot minute. Now, this is for a couple of reasons, one being the mythological designs and themes of the spells themselves. Myth has probably my favorite looking spells in the entire game. I mean, you got Orthrus, Celestial Calendar, Basilisk, Humongo Frog. The list goes on. Every single spell is either extremely cool or completely out of left field, and it's an absolute treat to cast them. Secondly, and this is a little bit biased because I got really lucky from PAX RNG and got the Myth healing spell Grendel's Amends, but Myth is just so much fun to solo with as an experienced player. You have all the tools you need like heals, AoEs, utility. You're still not really that tanky. but you have a little bit more resistance than fire and storm, so you're just fragile enough to have a fun time, but not so weak defensively that it gets frustrating. If you've never made a myth and you have some experience with the game and have yet to build one, I'd recommend it. It's really fun, but it's probably less fun if you're a new player, and also don't get extremely RNG blessed like me with pack openings getting Grundle's Immense like an absolute champ. Lastly, Myth also has some good nuke potential, and a big number is always fun to watch. Myth averages out to a 4 out of 5 stars when it comes to fun factor in my opinion. It's just a blast to play for me personally. This leaves Myth with a total ranking of 3 out of 5 stars. It might be the lowest rated school so far, but it's extremely fun to play in my opinion, despite its lack of niches and general awkwardness as a school. If you love the spell theme or are an experienced player, I'd recommend Myth, but if you're soloing or aren't a 4-stack, Myth isn't really all that optimal and struggles to find a proper place in a team. Now we're moving on to the Life School. It's a school that I gave way too little credit in the last tier list because holy hell, this school is good. Now, Life's primary job is as a support school, being the best healing school in the game by a country mile. Now, that may be what they're best known for, but that's not really all they do. Life Wizards have the second most health in the game, making them extremely viable as a tank. They can also do a ton of healing on the side very well. Now, sure, Ice and Death can learn Satyr and buy Rebirth treasure cards and do that job kinda well, but the amount of outgoing healing that Life gets from their gear makes them heal for absolutely bonkers, staggering amounts. Being able to almost fully heal the entire party with just a single cast of like Pigsy even sometimes, which Ice and Death just straight up can't do without sacrificing a bunch of other stats to build for it. Now, accessibility wise, Life is honestly a pretty easy school to grasp and get into because their niche is a staple in almost every MMO out there. You're the healing class, you heal people. That's what you do, and it's not hard to understand that. You also have a ton of health and a ton of resistance, so even though your early game fights may be longer than other schools, you're not really gonna have to worry about dying too much because of your incredible healing and tanking stats. Now, Life does suffer from late game tanking being the hardest role to grasp, but as long as you have good resistance, you can mostly get the job done here. 4 out of 5 stars for accessibility. Not much is holding it back aside from the lack of early game AoEs and difficulty curve for late game tanking. Now for soloing, it's gonna follow the same trend of tank schools being good at it. Life is an utterly fantastic choice to solo the game with, in my opinion. Fantastic defensive stats, easy full heals without the use of Life Mastery or any other pay-to-win features, incredible depth in comparison to other schools when it comes to healing spells in specific, the list goes on. Life Wizards also don't have to worry about spending training points on Satyr, which allows them to spec into Feint as soon as possible, which is another fantastic bonus for their soloing status. And now, as perfect of a solo school as Life may be, it does have one small problem, and it happens to be the one that Death also has. They don't get an AoE until level 48. Granted, the AoE that they get is utterly amazing and fantastic, and even makes them viable as a backup hitter for second arc Forest Lord. It's insane. You have to go through all of first arc to get there, and oh man, playing Mushu and Dragonspire without an AoE is just an absolute nightmare. It sucks, it's awful. One final negative Life has is that they don't have any life drain with their attacks, which is admittedly a complete and utter nitpick, considering how cheap it can be for them to full heal, and that only one school in the game can do the heal and attack thing, but it still sets Life back a bit in comparison to Death, who never has to spend turns or pips on heals ever, barring incredibly tough boss fights or just multiplayer shenanigans. Considering how cheap it is for Life to heal all of their health back though, this doesn't set them back nearly as much as it sets back Ice. I'm gonna give Life 4 out of 5 stars in solo ability. It's a fantastic solo option, but it's just a bit worse than Death in my opinion. Now, Life is the big heal school, so you can imagine how much utility it can provide to a team. Life has access to tons and tons and tons of healing spells, some of which can heal a target, along with some of the positive side effects, such as getting rid of traps on selected wizard and getting rid of dots on, again, the selected wizard, which are extremely nichely useful, but still useful nonetheless. That being said, all Life really has in terms of utility is, well, a lot of heals. And don't get me wrong, this is extremely good. It's extremely useful. Probably the most useful utility to have in the game if you had to pick one, but they're not able to weaken enemies like Death or buff players as hard as Balance, which we'll be talking about next. What Life can do though is second arc backup hitting. See, the AoE that Life gets at level 48, again, Forest Lord. It's strong, man. It has no side effects and focuses purely on that big fat damage number, making it a surprisingly viable hit for mid and even late game. These reasons give Life a 4 out of 5 stars in utility. They pretty much do just one thing, which is healing, but they do it extremely well. Kind of like Storm in that regard, just with no competition in the big number niche, and the big number niche is healing, not hitting. Now, when it comes to how fun a school is to play, I'm gonna state again, For the record, this is a stat that is extremely subjective and variable from person to person, but I don't think life is all that fun. In a team, you're going to be doing a lot of tanking and occasionally healing in some tough fights, but for a good chunk of the game, you're going to be doing a lot of nothing if you're playing in a team. Late game tanking is super fun though, I will say that again for the record, and spells like Rebirth, Forest Lord, and Gnomes are really cool and funny in their own right. 3.5 out of 5 stars, and the fun factor, life is a school that gets more and more fun the further you get in the game. This gives life a grand total of 3.875 out of 5 stars. A very solid school once you get past the early game hump. Life is super duper strong and can viably run in both the support role and the tank role, and just gets more and more fun the further you get into the game. I don't know why more people aren't playing it, because it is one of the most unpopular schools in the game, and that is a goddamn crime. Now, last up on the list here, we have Balance, a school that is a pure and bona fide support in every single sense of that word. Balance's primary niche is that it's a buff bot. They get free access to both Elemental Blade and Spirit Blade, as well as their trap counterparts without having to spend training points on them, as well as getting access to both Balance Blade and Blade Storm, which can be used to buff any school of spell possible. While most schools only get access to blades that can buff their own, this means that no matter who you're on Balance with, whether it's Storm, whether it's Life, whether it's Fire, whether it's Myth, whatever, any school out there, period, their big hits will be doing 45% more damage than they would be if you're running no Balance in your party. And these aren't spells you can get with training points either. They're spells that only Balance has access to via spell quests, so aside from treasure cards, these spells are exclusive to Balance wizards. This monopoly on those two blades leaves Balance as the de facto support school to butter up hitters for huge, big, fat, dummy damage numbers, and any player will be more than happy to see a Balance wizard on their team, especially hitters. Seriously, it's almost like night and day when you go from playing with a Balance to without a Balance. Balance isn't a particularly hard school to play when it comes to accessibility because, a lot like Life, your role is very clear and very defined. You buff, and sometimes you can hit or heal, sure, but you're mostly just gonna buff. And Balance, unlike some of the designated tank schools, don't have to think about too much when it comes to what they're doing each turn during really tough endgame dungeons and bosses. They're mostly just doing the same things you've always been doing, buffing a hitter or occasionally healing. That is unless you're running Balance as a tank support hybrid, in which case, yeah, the difficulty ramps up hard. Although it's worth noting that Balance is certainly viable in this position as well if you don't have any friends who want to run Ice, Life, or Death for whatever reason. The only serious obstacle for Balance players is that they don't have access to any prism of any kind. See, in Wizard 101, enemies will always be a part of one of the 7 schools that we've talked about, aside from, I guess, astral enemies and shadow enemies, but shut up, don't talk about that. And they'll have huge amounts of resistance to that school. For example, an ice enemy will have a ton of ice resistance, taking damage from ice spells that will just take so much less, upwards of 80% even, and so on and so on. Prisms are used to convert your school's damage to a school that does super effective damage to it. So that ice beetle you're using on that ice enemy will get converted to fire damage and it'll do super effective damage against it. Balance doesn't have this kind of spell in its arsenal, and that lack of prism means that killing Balance enemies and bosses can be kinda awkward, and you have to use a specific set of spells to do other schools' damage to take them out, like Hydra or Chimera. Other than this though, Balance is pretty straightforward and easy to play, earning them a 4 out of 5 star ranking for accessibility. Soloing, in my opinion, is where Balance really suffers as a school. Now, there are some positives to Balance as a solo school, so let's get those out of the way first. Balance has the 3rd highest natural health and resistance in the game, meaning they don't have to worry about dying all too much. They also have their own heals, so spending training points on Satyr is completely unnecessary, which frees up their training point economy a bit more, as well as makes their healing significantly easier to pull off in combat without a life mastery, since they can dedicate power pips towards their own school's heals. All great tanking stuff. We've been over how good all of this stuff is while talking about other schools like Life, Death, Ice, etc., and it's certainly great for Balance too, don't get me wrong on that. Now, for the negatives, there are 2 pretty big ones in particular. The first being a lack of prisms, which I've been over already. An even bigger issue for Balance though is the lack of buffs they have for themselves. Their first unique blade, the Balance Blade, only buffs for 25% damage compared to every other school's 35% buff. This is already not great, but it gets worse. Their second blade, Blade Storm, buffs only 20% but costs a pip to cast. Compare that to either Elemental or Spirit Blade respectively, which all the other schools have access to, and buffs for 35% and are obtained a world earlier, by the way. You just feel kind of bad for Balance, and it gets kind of sad for soloing purposes. Don't get me wrong, these 2 spells make Balance feel extremely strong and unique when you're playing in a group setting, allowing them to buff anyone they play with like no tomorrow, but it makes soloing a much more obnoxious experience. It's a bit of a double-edged sword in that regard because of these negatives, and I'm gonna give Balance a 2 out of 5 stars in solo ability. Now, team lane utility, I'm sure you can imagine, this is the category where Balance really shines. It's pretty easy to see why that is. Again, the ton of unique blades we've been over, Balanced Blade, Blade Storm, the Elemental Spears even, don't cut through enemy res. They have some solid heals that are very useful throughout the game, especially if you don't have a life in your party. They pretty much have any possible support you could ever need ever. Oh, they even have a weakness charm you can put on the enemies to nerf their damage, like Death, although granted it's not as good. Balance was made for team play, and its arsenal reflects that 100%. From early game to end game, they're an excellent school that can make any party run smoothly. They're like the oil in the engine, they're the grease in the gears. It's great. 5 out of 5 stars for team play and utility, an unbelievable school for the support role, fantastic in a team, just an amazing all-around kit for support in particular. Now, the usual double-edged sword of balance applies when it comes to how fun the school is to play, in the sense that if you're playing with a team, the school is absolute 5 out of 5, super fun, super engaging for me. Casting your spells on your hitters, watch them do big damage. It's like you did that damage, but somehow you feel a little bit more proud of doing it. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just me. I just like supporting the hitters. I don't know. If you're playing alone though, you don't get that fun factor at all. It's probably the least fun school in the entire game, bar none, to solo with even. I'm gonna give Balance a 3 out of 5 stars for fun factor. It's extremely fun in a group, extremely dull to solo with. This leaves Balance with a grand total of, drumroll please, edit that in there somewhere, 3.5 out of 5 stars, 3.5 out of 5 stars. Balance is the most stacked support school in the game and is a great school when it comes to setting up allies for their hits. When playing alone, again, we've been over it a million times at this point, it's a broken record. It falls flat on its face. Now with all the school reviews being done, let's see how they all stack up to each other when it came to the stars, the numerical ranking. It should be kept in mind that some of these schools are a bit worse for newer players than they are for seasoned veterans. For example, some of the hitting schools are going to be a little lower on the list than I would rank them for people that have played the game. It's also worth noting, keep it in the back of the noggin, no school in the game is below 3 out of 5 stars. So every single school is at least above average and completely viable in their own right. Now in first place, far and away, only school above 4-star average, it's Death, baby. 4.25 stars out of 5. Life is bringing up the rear in second, not too far behind, 3.875 stars out of 5. Balance in third, 3.5 out of 5 stars. Fire in fourth with 3.375 out of 5. And then we have a tie for 5th place with Storm and Ice, both 3.25 out of 5. And then 7th, you know him, you love him, it's Myth, 3 out of 5. It's still bad. Orthrus wasn't enough, baby. Get some more buffs going, please. Get more minions in here. Now, lastly, I do want to touch on the PvP stats a little bit. I don't know much about PvP, and I'm not going to claim to know anything about PvP, but there are 2 sets of PvP related data released by the WIZARD101 devs on Twitter. This first one here is a PvP popularity chart, which displays how popular each school is for PvP at different levels. And this tweet here ranks each school from highest win rate to lowest. Again, these are all statistics. I can't really make any personal opinions on the matter, but take from these what you will. Thanks so much for watching, and hey, since you've made it all the way here, why not subscribe? It helps me out immensely and costs you nothing. And if you want some more WIZARD101 content, here's me and my friend Steve seeing who can deliver Cyrus Drake's laundry the fastest. Take care, everybody, and if you haven't already, play some WIZARD101. It's a great time.